Hello and welcome to NDA, the podcast all about non-duality. Welcome. This is NDA, the podcast all about duality and non-duality. If in the first instance you think that non-dual awareness or non-duality sounds like some kind of extravagant concept that's not relevant to you in your life, just bear with me, because I'd like you to sit back and just listen for a couple of minutes, because duality and non-duality are probably the two most important concepts in most of our lives. And the reason why is they affect almost everything that we experience as human beings. Because duality and non-duality are linked to our conscious experience of the world. What that means is how we create an understanding of the outer and the inner world is not fixed. How we can generate happiness and unhappiness, how we can generate anger, resentment, passion, desire, have a degree of freedom and flexibility and choice in them. And one of the ways that this can be understood is by thinking about duality and non-duality. As a starting point, let me introduce myself in a bit more detail. I am a trained cognitive psychologist. I have a master's in neuroscience, gained from the University of Kent here in the UK. But if we were thinking about duality and non-duality, my journey, my knowledge, my experience and background goes back many, many years. In fact, I've been practicing non-dual meditation and studying non-dual theoretical frameworks for at least 20 years within the Buddhist Tibetan traditions. Primarily, but not exclusively, the Vajrayana traditions and the Dzogchen tradition. Before that, I was a spiritual practitioner as a young man, and even as a boy, I could say. And I'm in my 50s now, so that means I've been thinking about what's real, what's meaningful, what can I trust, and why do I understand the world in the way that I do for at least 40 years. So that's a little bit about why non-duality is of interest to me, and some of the ideas and some of the background that's helped shape my approach to it. But why a podcast? Well, earlier this week I was talking to a friend of mine, Andy, and amongst the subjects that we touched on was the way that duality and non-duality is discussed, understood and communicated in society. But it occurred to us in our last meeting that there's a lot of information that is actually really quite important or would be useful for people to know, but it's obscured. It's often contained within spiritual traditions or abstract philosophical schools, but most of it is pretty simple and straightforward. How we can understand what's going on around us, how we can understand ourselves, is wrapped up in terms like dual and non-dual. But the reality is it's part of our lived experience. It's part of how we understand our day-to-day lives. But before we go any further into the incredible idea of non-dual view, non-dual awareness, I'm just going to set out some of the basic ideas that we have regarding duality and non-duality as a point of reference, as a starting point. I should say at the outset that with duality and non-duality, we're talking about consciousness. We're talking about the way that we have constructed our understanding of what's around us. So what I or anyone else says, for that matter, doesn't have to be taken so seriously at this stage. If you belong to a religious tradition or a philosophical tradition, or have a guide or a teacher, there's nothing that we're going to say that's going to contradict with those views. We're just presenting our ideas and putting them on the table, and feel free to accept them or dismiss them, to regard them as being part of a learning process whereby they may be useful or not to you. So we'll just park all of that to one side and start to just to talk about the terms of duality and non-duality. Okay, there's a lot of things that could be said, but as a starting point, to understand the discussion about duality and non-duality from a Western scientific point of view, and this is not a complex philosophical discussion. This is kind of the everyday way that we can start to approach it. We can think about the work of French mathematician and philosopher René Descartes. Now, Descartes died around about 1650, and yet his ideas are incredibly important still today. He was one of the greatest thinkers of his time. One of the ideas that he left us with is that our body and minds are separate, and it's this concept is known as mind-body dualism, or the mind-body problem. That if you analyze, if you consider it from different perspectives, it can appear that what goes on in our minds, our thought processes, or what we would call today even our cognitive processes, that these are separate from the physical nature of our body. Now, there's some very sound and logical reasons why that might appear to be the case. You can, if you cut your finger off, your thought processes still exist. It doesn't necessarily affect your thought processes. I mean, it can hurt you, and you might feel pain, or you might feel loss, or feel whatever. But eventually your thought processes will carry on, and they may carry on despite what's happened to your finger, despite what happens to your body. You may be able to transcend your physical state with your mind. And this is suggestive of, that the two systems are not related, or are separate. Now, as science has progressed, and bear in mind, Descartes was writing, over 350 years ago, but as science has progressed, certainly in the 20th and the 21st century, we've now come to realize that there is a very strong relationship between the mind and the body. So, as a very kind of general idea, a dualistic approach of the mind, or the mind and the body, is that they're separate. They are divided. They are not interrelated. And a non-dual view is that there is a connection, there is a relationship between them. It's not possible to see them as separate. So, finding another point of reference, one of the other key areas that can be used to approach and to understand and to think about duality and non-duality, the non-dual view, non-dual awareness, is self and other separation. There's a general sense in society that people are not directly connected. So if you're walking down the street, there is someone on the opposite side of the road to you, and you are two separate, unconnected individuals. You don't know this person, they don't know you. So you have a form of duality, you and them. And conceptually within our minds, we think of ourselves and our needs, and we don't necessarily think about the other person's needs in the same way as ours, because we're not connected. But consider, that person unbeknown to you may be related. They, by the mere fact that they're human beings and they may come from the same kind of ethnic background, you may share a lot of DNA in common. You're made of the same stuff. You have the same processes in your body. So there's a commonality even before we start thinking about any kind of social-based relationship. You and this person share a huge amount in common. But think further, 8 theoretical scenarios that unbeknown to you, this person might be related to you. They could be a sibling that you didn't know anything about. They could be a child. Life is complicated. Something may have happened in your life, and this person may be directly blood related to you in some way. Talking of blood, if you're a blood donor, this person may have your blood in them. So to what extent someone that's got your blood, your cells in their body, can they be separate to you? To what extent? Now, I'm not saying that, we are all identical. I'm simply challenging the basic premise that self and other is different. Take it further. What if you've donated, a kidney or bone marrow, and that person has, an organ or part of your body in theirs? To what extent are you separate? Think of it in a more subtle level. That's kind of quite an extreme example, and that's not going to happen to us very often. Where someone we're related to walks past us in the street and we don't recognise or know who they are. But think simply about two people passing the street, and if you stare or talk to somebody, then you influence them in some way. You have some connection that if you are unpleasant or kind, you change their mental state. You may change the trajectory of their life. If you offer somebody a great kindness for no reason or a great unpleasantness for no reason, it could affect them in some way that could be quite profound. So to what extent can we say that we're separate? If some person can exert a great influence on you, to what extent can we say that these are two separate entities, unconnected and unrelated? So these are general ideas about duality that I'm putting forward. They're not meant to be taken too seriously. They're just different ways of understanding how duality and non-duality can be thought about, can be approached. Now, from a scientific point of view, there's not a huge amount of work that's done with understanding non-duality. And that's because the nature of duality is that what appears to be the status quo is what we accept as normal, what we accept as the way that the world really is. And throughout the course of human history, we can find that the default setting that we appear to have as humans is to see that things are separated, that things are unrelated. And philosophical and spiritual traditions some philosophical and spiritual traditions have a tendency to challenge that view and to think, well, once you analyze in more detail about your own mind and the relationship between your mind and the world in general, then some of those dualistic ideas don't actually work. So we've looked at a couple of examples of how we can understand duality. That the body and the mind are separate, but they're not really. There's many ways we can think about that. The placebo effect, or we can think about how physical health is linked to mental health and how mental health is linked to physical health. We can also think about the idea that people are separate individuals. Even though we can interact in positive and negative ways, we may physically, the cells in our body can overlap in many different ways. If you think about two people that can come together and to create a child, now is the child separate from the parents, or is that child separate from all of the genetic material that's been put into it from the previous generations? These are ideas. Of themselves, they don't approach the kind of the fuller truth, the fuller explanation of the non-dual view, but they start to open up the subject area where we can. One of the key things about this is the word dichotomy. A dichotomy being a choice between two things, where, for example, in a sporting sense, you can choose between the blue team or the red team, and you decide which is yours, and you pick a side and you go with that, and if the blue team wins, you're happy, and if the red team loses, you're sad. And that's a construct that's made up. we fall into that way of thinking, because that's how society and that's how our ideas are formed. But if you think about conflict, wars, aggression, if you think about problems, and a lot of psychological problems, they're about dividing things up which are not naturally divided, about people can become our enemies, or resources are ours or not ours, our status is threatened by other people. And quite often, if you analyze, if you think about, and you carry out some exercises, particularly meditation that's related to understanding the dualism and non-dualism around us, then a lot of the ideas that we hold aren't sustainable when they're subject to this kind of analysis. And dichotomy is a key point. It's a key point to raise, that we can choose this or that. But life is not that simple, and experience isn't that simple. So if I ask you to name me who is in your city the best sports team, is it the Reds or the Blues? Okay, you can give an answer, and you may actually believe in that answer, but let's face it. It's like the red team may have a fantastic player who's playing in a poor team. They may be unlucky, they may be underfunded, they may have better quality players, may be more creative, or they may be much less creative, but win. It's too simple to look at any situation and say, this is entirely due to one factor, or I am right and you are wrong. Or take a case in the UK at the moment. This is probably quite a good example, because the UK has had a referendum and is planning to leave at the time of making this podcast, is about to leave the European Union. And we're seeing an incredible polarity in the two sides of this particular debate, to remain in the UK or to leave the UK. And it's quite clear, it's quite clear to everybody that there are two extreme positions now being held, and there's very little middle ground. And there's so many problems that need to be overcome, and there's so many opportunities on both sides, on both positions. But people who are holding to one position are refusing to acknowledge the merits of the other side. And that's happening on both sides. I'm not making a case for or against leaving or staying in the EU, but I'm suggesting that to say that my side is right in all things probably isn't helpful, or that my point of view reflects the reality and your point of view doesn't reflect the reality. I have to say that the non-dual view isn't simply about accepting everything, because what's not reasonable, what's not useful, what's not sustainable is not part of the non-dual view. The non-dual view, or non-dual awareness, should lead towards greater understanding, not lesser understanding. Once we break away from systems which limit our ability to see what's actually going on, we should gain more clarity, not less clarity. So this is not a charter for anything goes. This is a charter for, this is the non-dual awareness should take us towards a more meaningful understanding of ourselves and others. It's probably a useful moment as well to reiterate that if you are part of a spiritual tradition, or if you are following a particular course of study or personal investigation into conscious understanding, there's nothing we're going to say which contradicts that. These are ideas, and feel free to think about them or not think about them according to what your needs are at the moment. So there's a little bit of groundwork we've done there in saying that this idea of things that are separate or not separate, it's around us all the time. In the next conversation you have about sport or about music or about life or about literature, you may find yourself falling into these dichotomies, these dualisms, to say, well, this country is bad, or this kind of person is good, or these kind of ideas are not going to help us and these kind of ideas will. Strip all of that away and analyze the information you've got. Yes, fall back on past experience. I'm not suggesting that all stereotypes are not useful. The way that our brains work, we rely on experience. But to only use experience, which has been created in a narrow dualistic way, may not be the most useful way to approach life's problems. Now, it may surprise you if you are new to thinking about the non-dual view, that there are a wide range of competing ideas and theories. And when this podcast is finished, if you were to do a search on the internet for non-duality or dualism, you could find a wide range of ideas that both compete, complement and conflict. It's not such a simple thing. Different religious traditions, different philosophical traditions can approach the subject from different directions. They can see different presentations of truth within their own perspectives. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about that at the moment. We are going to cover that in a future podcast. But right now, I'd like to just explain one way of approaching this, so as to be able to make sense straight away of some of the different ways of thinking about non-duality. And the first is some non-dual approaches and some philosophical ideas about non-duality I can describe as universal. So any theory about non-duality that explains the universe and everything in it, and everything everywhere in terms of duality or non-duality, as I've already hinted, we can think about that as being universal explanations of non-duality, and these tend to be theoretical. They can be linked to scientific principles, or they can be linked to pseudo-scientific principles, but they are about what's going on around us all the time. They may include understanding or expressions of what's happening in ourselves, but when you come into contact with those, you'll recognize them straight away, because someone was saying that, well, this is how life started, or this is why humans suffer, or this is why the planets exist. And there are philosophies and there are structures and ways of thinking that link dualism and non-dualism to these universal ideas. Much more common is to think about non-duality in terms of objective experience. And by objective experience, I mean the way that people in general understand themselves and others. And we can count some scientific approaches, some philosophical approaches. We can think about counseling, we can think about psychology, we can think about certain religious ideas that define frameworks within which everyone's experience can fit. Now, I'm not going to suggest that these are valid or not valid, and there's a whole range of different ideas anyway. It would be impossible to sum them up. But when we talk about something that's not directly related to our own experience from a non-dual perspective, it becomes quite a difficult area, because it's quite hard for me to talk to you about how you have constructed consciousness. There are common factors in how people think of the world and think of themselves, but there is a degree of uniqueness about the positions we create. And so one of the themes in this podcast, one of the themes that will reoccur from time to time, is the third way of approaching the non-dual view, non-dual awareness, and that's our own individual subjective appreciation. And that's very much what I'm offering now. Now, I've introduced different philosophical and religious ideas, and they will continue to reappear throughout the podcasts. But the essence is, the point of this exposition of non-dual awareness, the non-dual view, is your experience of it. There are commonalities between people, and having spoken to a lot of people and meditated with a lot of people and read a lot of books about this, there are certain similarities between how we make sense of the world. But the actual experience of duality, and when it breaks down our ability to engage with non-duality, it's a personal phenomena. And the purpose of these discussions are to draw your attention to your own experience. I really don't think there's that much use in anybody listening to me and saying, okay, this person knows what they're talking about, therefore I will adopt or follow some of those ideas. The Tibetans have a way of expressing this. They talk about a hand pointing at the moon. And what that means is that no matter how skilled and gifted somebody can be in explaining experience-based phenomena like non-duality, all I or anyone else can do, and my teachers, the kind people that have instructed me and taught me over many years with great patience and great compassion, all they've done is point in a direction which I've had to follow. So if you have an interest in non-duality, it will ultimately, your experience of non-duality will be linked to what happens to you. And whatever you read and whoever speaks to you and wherever you go, they can all add direction and influence your thinking. But in the end, the non-dual view, non-dual awareness is about your conscious experience. And that's something that you are responsible for constructing, maintaining and deconstructing. So, just to recap before we bring this first episode of the NDA podcast to an end, we've looked at some of the general principles that we can use to approach the non-dual view, the idea of polarized positions, dichotomies, dualities. And non-dual awareness is about attempting to see things in a more free-form way. And we used the examples of the very famous example of Cartesian duality, or mind-body duality, or the mind-body problem as it's sometimes known. I also introduced the concept of self and other duality, the extent to which we are actually separated from other people. And some of the ideas that we have, or some of the ideas that are present in society, are worth looking at a little bit more closely. But the key thing from this first episode is just to bring in some basic ideas, to provide some tools, and to stress the idea that how we see the world is a choice. There appear to be natural ways of looking at things, but if we sit and we contemplate a little bit, we can see that some of the default settings that we've got can be changed and are not necessarily reliable. However, more of that the next time. It only remains for me to say thanks very much for listening, and I've got to give a credit to the music, and that's Lee Rosevere, and the music you can hear on this podcast is from a track called Let's Start at the Beginning. So thanks very much, and see you next time.